Recently, Minnesota lost its only commuter rail line, the Northstar route. I'd been meaning to check out this train while it was still around, and fortunately we were able to do so last month. The Northstar line ran about 40 miles from downtown Minneapolis to the suburb of Big Lake. Minnesota used to have a bunch of electric interurban and commuter rail, as well as an extensive electric trolley system, but that's all been long gone since at least the 1950s. The Northstar line didn't start passenger service until 2009, so it's a relatively recent train system. When envisioned in the late 1990s, the train was supposed to run to St. Cloud, a bedroom community about 65 miles from Minneapolis. Some early plans had it running even farther, about 80 miles to the town of Rice in Benton County. I've lived in Minnesota long enough to remember the excitement of a new rail line when the Northstar was first under construction. Passenger rail isn't really a thing in the US these days, so a new rail line was something pretty interesting. The streamlined locomotives and the two-level passenger cars really looked futuristic compared to the regular dirty, boxy freight trains that you see. Some model companies even released HO-scale Northstar train toys, which are probably collector's items now. I'm a bit of a rail fan myself, and I actually own one of Minnesota's other lesser-known passenger trains. The Minnesota Zoo operated a monorail from the 1970s until 2013, and I bought one of the surplus trains a few years later. I don't plan on buying any surplus Northstar trains. They're a little bit bigger, heavier, and more difficult to move than a novelty monorail. One of the reasons that the Northstar line never really went anywhere was the lack of double-tracked rail between Big Lake and St. Cloud. Now, this segment was upgraded to double-track by BNSF in 2015, but the funding to expand passenger service never materialized.
Final call for Coon Rapids. Next stop is Anoka.
Twin Cities locals often joked that the Northstar was a train to nowhere, mainly serving a series of park-and-ride lots strung out along the Mississippi River. While it did save some time versus rush hour driving and was a little cheaper than downtown parking, most riders still had to own a car to get to and from the train. The local Metropolitan Council leased the track from BNSF, and the trains shared the route with freight and Amtrak trains. This is the busiest rail corridor in the Twin Cities area, and while early operations saw high reliability and on-time service, freight trains often had priority and would frequently delay passenger service. Partly due to the lack of any real destination, ridership on the Northstar never quite met expectations. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the switch to remote work, commuter numbers dropped even further. By early 2025, the state legislature had canceled the funding, and the last trains ran on January 4th of 2026. Future commuting from northeast suburbs will rely on buses and local highways. Despite being interested in the line since it opened, I never actually got around to riding it until right before it closed. Since the route didn't go anywhere, there was nothing really interesting to visit along the way and no real destination, so the ride itself was the only attraction. I always meant to ride the train just because it was something sort of unique that we don't really have anywhere else in the Midwest other than Chicago, but there was never really any reason to. I think if the train had actually gone somewhere like St. Cloud, I would have ridden it sooner. I've actually never been to St. Cloud either, even though I've lived here for almost 2 decades. The freeway bypasses the town, and I'm not really sure what there is in St. Cloud. If you're a St. Cloud resident, leave a comment about local attractions, and maybe I'll stop by there sometime. We finally checked out the Northstar in December after hearing of its imminent demise, and it seemed like we weren't the only ones. Interest in riding this local oddity had increased with the announcement that it was being shut down, and there were a lot of rail fans and local transit enthusiasts checking it out. I even met a few fans of the channel on board. This might be the most ridership the train has seen since the pandemic. It wasn't 100% full, but it was definitely busy. The train itself is pretty basic, with no onboard services or anything. The cars have restrooms, and some of the seats offer tables, so they're definitely comfortable, and they would be a good place to sit down with your laptop and get some work done on the way into the office. These trains were originally designed in Canada in the 1970s, but they look and feel fairly modern. I did joke about trying to buy one for Sandland, but again, they're too big and too heavy, and they'd be very expensive to move anywhere. Since the Northstar rolling stock is relatively new in American terms, some of it will be reused by Amtrak, and some will go to Texas to support the upcoming World Cup this summer. One interesting feature of these trains is the rear control cab in the last car. Since the track doesn't have a place to turn trains around, they run forward to Big Lake and then reverse back to Minneapolis. The operator sits in the rear cab for the reverse trip, and this car also has air horns for road crossings. It reminded me of the Alaska Railroad's train to Whittier that would reverse through the tunnel back to Anchorage using a rear cab. The Northstar ride up to Big Lake was pretty interesting, as you get to see parts of Minneapolis and the suburbs that aren't necessarily visible from the highway. This is always a cool aspect of train travel. You get to see kind of the backside of everything, and it's especially interesting in former industrial areas that used to rely on freight rail. I've been across these tracks many times. I've been under these tracks on the Mississippi River, and if it weren't illegal, I may or may not have walked down these tracks occasionally, but there's still something kind of cool about actually riding a train across them. It was also interesting, but also a little disappointing to see townhouse and condo developments that had sprung up right next to the stations, letting people live at the rail line to their downtown jobs. Some of these developments were even named after the stations. With the end of rail service, there will be a lot more bus and car traffic from these places. We caught the last evening train that offered a return trip, so the ride back to Minneapolis was after dark and not quite as interesting. It was still worth the experience, and I'm glad we got around to finally riding this quirky thing before Minnesota once again loses its interurban transit. If we want to experience commuter rail in the future, we'll probably have to visit Chicago or one of the coasts. There's been talk of extending Amtrak service into the Northeast Twin Cities suburbs and possibly new commuter trains to Rochester and Duluth. Driving long distance can be a hassle, and air travel just keeps getting worse every year, so a third option for medium and long range trips would be fantastic. I would visit more out-of-the-way towns like St. Cloud if they had a convenient way to go there, and I might actually stop in Rochester more often instead of just blasting through on the freeway. I would also love a train to Duluth. Driving up there is always kind of terrible since I-35 is basically a permanent construction zone for the last 20 years, so I would absolutely take a train up to the Great Lakes if I could. I'm sad to see the Northstar line retired instead of expanding, but I'm glad I got to ride it while it was still around. If you liked this video, check out my other video about riding Amtrak's Empire Builder from the West Coast to Minneapolis. You can also check out some of my Sandland videos if you want to find out what we did with that zoo monorail. Thanks to everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.